I'm Bob Gerald, and for the next 10 minutes or so, I want to talk to you about how poverty impacts all of us, particularly in regard to the Pensacola-Escambia County area. You see, there are myths about poverty. There are things that you and I believe about poverty, some of which are only partially true and some of which aren't true at all. Let's address some of those myths and facts. Myth: the poor are all on governmental assistance. The fact is, assistance accounts for only about 25% of the income of adults living in poverty. It's a much smaller figure than you and I believe. We think they're all on assistance, and that's just not the fact. Myth: poor people just don't want to work. I mean, come on, we all know that. Fact: the majority of the working poor, 60% are full-time workers. 60% are working full-time and still live below the poverty guidelines. Let them work for minimum wage. Let's just, minimum wage. Let them get a job for minimum wage. After all, it's $7.25 an hour. It's $290 a week. It's $1,200 a month. It's $14,000 a year. But there's a different standard out there called the Self-sufficiency standard. And it's a measure, county by county throughout the entire United States, what it takes for somebody to live with dignity and self-sufficiently without assistance. It includes things like housing and childcare, food, transportation, health, and others. So let's take a look at that for Escambia County. The self-sufficiency standard is $8 an hour for Escambia County, monthly of $1,400, annually of $16,895, as opposed to the $14,500 that you can make at minimum wage. So even with a full-time minimum wage job, you're below the self-sufficiency standard. The poverty guideline for this particular demographic, one single person, is $10,000, $830 a year. I'd like to see you try to survive on $10,000, $830 a year without any kind of assistance. For an adult and child, it goes up to $13.79, or $29,000 a year, as a self-sufficiency standard for one adult with one child, including things like childcare. The poverty guideline for this demographic is $14,550. If you're a full-time working mother and you're making minimum wage at $14,500, you're below the minimum wage if you have a child. Here's a myth: if you don't have money, you just don't spend it, but it costs more to shop at the grocery store, sometimes $1 a gallon extra for milk at the corner grocery, because you can't go down to the supermarket and you can't go get the deals that are available because you got no transportation. You have to put up with what's in the neighborhood. It costs more to cash a check. There are 14 million people in the United States called the unbanked, people that don't have any relationship with the bank, and for them, they've got to go and cash a check for $5 each time they cash a check. The people with the least money, it costs the most for them to survive in some instances. Public transportation is time-consuming and inconvenient, and it's been demonstrated all across the country that where you have an insufficient public transportation system, people can't get to work. It takes them an hour and a half in the rain just to catch the right buses, to make the transfers, to get to work. It's a difficult thing with transportation, because if you don't have many people using it, where are you going to get the funding? And if you don't have the funding, how are you going to create a sufficient system? It's a chicken and an egg. But transportation is one of the most difficult barriers that people in poverty deal with. Here's a myth: it's a minority thing. Poverty is a minority thing, except the fact is that 48% of those people living in poverty in America are white. Myth: the United States is one of the lowest poverty rates in the industrialized world. Well, according to the Organization of Economically Developed Countries, we're 28th. We have a higher poverty rate than 27 of those 30 countries. We are right next to Mexico and Turkey. Now, we think of Mexico as being a land full with poverty, except we are right next door, both literally and figuratively, in terms of poverty to Mexico. Myth: the U.S. spends more money on helping the poor than any other industrialized nation. We're actually 4 from the bottom. We spend less than 26 other countries in the Organization for Economically Developed Countries. We are, again, next to Turkey and Mexico. We spend less as a percentage of our GDP than most other industrialized nations. Here's a myth. It's not my problem. Here's the fact. Poverty costs all of us. Costs us jobs, costs us with unqualified workers, costs us with a reduced tax base, costs us with schools. $21 million at Sacred Heart in uncollected debt. Now, my understanding is, although I haven't changed these numbers, that this is much higher at this point. Who do you think pays that $21 million in debt, except for the people that have medical insurance like you and I have to go to Sacred Heart? Over $6 million at West Florida, over $21 million at Baptist. Borne by those of us that do pay. Here's a myth. It's easier to spend money on incarceration than it is on education. Perhaps in the short run. But poverty is linked to crime. The higher poverty, the more crime. It costs to incarcerate one inmate $21,000 a year. It costs $9,000 a year to educate a student. Our present school funding is not fully addressing our educational needs, leads to unskilled workers, leads to increased poverty, leads to a reduced tax base, further declining education, and creating a higher level of poverty. There's a tipping point somewhere in there by which we may never recover. I hope we're not there yet. We need to do something. We need to do something in terms of economic development. We need to do something in terms of reducing poverty to support our tax base to improve our education. 15% is the unemployment rate for high school dropouts. Less than 5% is the unemployment rate for college graduates. Education is an integral part in fighting poverty. Myth. You can't get rid of poverty. It's everywhere. Here's a poverty map of the United States. You'll notice there are a couple of hot spots in Texas along the border, out west between New Mexico and Arizona, along the Mississippi Delta. But let's take a look at it for our area. Let's take a look at our county specifically. Okaloosa has a poverty rate of 12.5%. Santa Rosa, which is a little bit better off, has a poverty rate of 11.4%. And Escambia County has a poverty rate of 18.9%, according to the U.S. Census Bureau in 2011. Let's take a look at the poverty percentage. Children in poverty. Okaloosa is 19.5%, Santa Rosa 17.6%, and Escambia County is 29%. Almost 1 in every 3 kids lives in poverty. It's represented in our elementary schools in that we have a subsidized lunch program that kids qualify for if they're in poverty. Some of these schools are no longer open, but in Warrington it was 91%, in Hallmark it was 93%. 93% of the kids qualify because of their poverty status for subsidized lunches. In Semmes it was 97%. Lincoln Park it was 93%. Montclair it was 96%. So why don't we do something about it? All we need is some economic development. Except blighted neighborhoods do not attract new business. Our reduced tax base cannot support the kinds of things that we need to do to attract new businesses. Our current tax base leads to poor educational funding, which leads to more and more unqualified workers. We have a poor worker retention, which creates higher business costs. Every time an employee turns over, it costs that business. And the more unqualified workers that we can't find to fill the jobs lead to higher business costs. There's less economic development and further reduced tax base. It's a cycle. Again, I don't know where the tipping point is, but it seems to be like it's getting closer. Economic development demands a qualified workforce. We have to be able to produce a qualified workforce if we're going to have economic development in this area. Let's talk about turnover costs. We just talked about them a second ago. Most businesses don't account very accurately for turnover costs, but there are exit costs, recruiting costs, interviewing costs, hiring costs. There are many costs associated with turnover. So let's take the turnover costs that are estimated for an $8 an hour entry-level employee. The Society of Human Resource Management says it's $3,500 per turnover. Coca-Cola Retailing Research says it's $3,637. American Management Association estimates it at about $4,000. And the American Hotel and Motel Association estimates it at $4,100. Many of the jobs in this area are hotel and motel jobs for tourists. If you're a medium-sized business, what is the cost of turnover? Let's take the smallest number from that chart, $3,500 per turnover. If you have 100 employees with a 50% turnover, it's going to cost you $175,000 a year as a business. If you're a slightly larger business, let's take that same $3,500. If you have 500 employees and you have a 60% turnover, it's going to cost over $1 million. We can't afford that. People are not going to come and economically develop in our area if we can't produce qualified workers. It's clear that training is needed in order to develop a ready workforce. But in addition to the standard skills training, there needs to be something that addresses the motivation and commitment that are needed in order to move someone into the working class. One of the things that exists in Pensacola is Getting Ahead into Just Getting By World. It's a 15-week course. Participants apply through a screening process, and attendance is required. It's run through the Bridges to Circles program, and for more information, you can go to www.uniteescambia.com and click on the little poverty icon in the form of a pig. It takes the entire community, governmental sector, business sector, education sector, and social service agencies, working together to effectively address poverty. So, learn about what's happening in our community. Learn what you can do to combat poverty in our community. This has been presented by the Poverty Solutions Team of Escambia County, building the foundations of prosperity. For more information, follow up on these links. Thank you very much.